everybody. It's Rillian back with another disc guidance. Today we'll be broadcasting from Amara2_MK to the main 2_MK channel, of course with full permission as always. Today we're looking for Kata 24, and it's pretty simple. It's another Kata that doesn't involve a bot. You just have to turn the CPU on to the required level, and you should be good to go from there. The character is Abigail, and the gauge settings are, as you see here, basically everything normal. Nothing required other than this. So we're going to switch this to CPU level 8. 7 can also work if you feel that you want the CPU to be a little more repetitive. But the main focus here is to learn some stuff about both Abigail's normals and the way that moves with hurt boxes that extend early change the throw boxes of the particular character. So the first thing we're looking at today is really simple. Abigail's hurt box moves forward when he does that, but so does his throw box, which allows you to literally throw Abigail out of Giant Flip. As he demonstrates quite happily here. You can throw him out of both the medium and the heavy. You can also throw him out of the EX if you know what you're doing in terms of the timing. So the idea of getting used to the character that you are facing being at a disadvantage because they tried to attack you is not an easy concept because it requires such precise timing for so many things. You can do it on some reaction, but he also tends to cancel into the move from other things. Fortunately for us, the current CPU AI will do this basically all day if you let it. The second thing that this Kata is supposed to teach you is that when you are still in block stun from something, and your opponent has cancelled from the move that put you into block stun, the timing for some of your stuff changes. So for example, with Abigail, if you try to learn this by the sound that he makes or something, you may find yourself in a lot of trouble because the timing is no longer quite the same. And the fact that the timing for different moves, different versions of the move is different, can make it even harder. Fortunately, as you can see, this is a relatively easy thing to get the CPU to do, and you don't have to worry about it a whole lot. You can also learn other things you can do in that position, and the way that Abigail interacts with those things. Now this isn't just about Abigail, this is about a lot of moves and a lot of characters. The main reason this doesn't work for most people is because the way that the hit box on your own attack extends means that you don't get much off of it. You tend to trade, but certain normals are very good at the job. But I'll show you with Ryu's Crouch Medium Punch instead what happens if you try to use that. As you can see, it's still effective, but you tend to get counter hit even though the timing feels as if it would be more or less the same. Whether or not you can actually test that to be so has a lot to do with your understanding of the character. But you will note that he is a bit more likely to trade when it does trade. You won't see the heavy punch trading often, and the throw basically can't. But that doesn't really mean much other than the fact that you didn't manage to do it in time. Throw is useful here in many situations because of the way that normals work relative to throw. Basically, once you have throw that hits on the same frame as the first active frame of a normal attack, the throw will win. Consistently so, in fact. So this gives you a lot of space for situations where you know that this will happen, such as defending against certain things Laura can do, certain things Rainbow Mika can do, even a few things that Ken can do. Simply because, even though your throw is relatively slow, the opponent's move can't necessarily beat it the way it could beat, let's say, a medium button if it were heavy. Now, this isn't necessarily true for everything, and we encourage you to test this out because different moves have unthrowable frames, different moves have certain properties that don't allow them to be defeated by throw timings, and so on. But there are still a lot of spacings and a lot of things you can do where this is the correct response. As long as the move has a hitbox that is behind its hurt box of some kind, and that hurt or throwable box moves into your throw range, you have good timing, you just go over like that. But the key part is that it must go into that range. Fortunately for us, Abigail is a good example for this because he has such a big spacing for that. Obviously your reactions also matter. But this is good for another reason, basically that you can do this while holding down back and only hit one thing. With the relative knowledge that if you're way too late into it, you'll still just block. Of course, you must be way too late for this to work. But it does give you an option for not having to deal with that move, which is actually relatively required because Abigail's giant flip is plus. You don't have an option. Once he gets it done, he is ahead of you. Well, the heavy one is ahead of you, and he can use his command throw and beat out quite a few things. So if you're not feeling comfortable in this matchup because your opponent intimidates you enough that they get to keep doing that, this is a potential way out of that for you. But, of course, as with all our kata, there are multiple parts to this. But there are other positions where this sort of thing is useful even though you're not using throw. It's quite common for a character's stronger, heavy punch and kick buttons, sweep included, to do a really good job of reaching quite far. And that's where the priority system of the game comes in, which is what I was explaining relative to the throw. If you're not familiar, basically, heavy attacks that hit on the same frame as medium attacks will usually win, and depending on whether or not they have the crush counter property, they will also crush counter the opponent. Pay attention to this in the upcoming arcade edition because certain crush counters, just a few of them, have been changed, and you are going to be in even more danger. Or in the case of a few, the crush counter is removed from a certain part of the move, but you still get it if you are doing something else, and it lets you set up the same situation. One of the big changes, therefore, is that neutral with crush counters like this has changed in one way or another, depending on whether or not your character has strong ones or relatively closer range and therefore, by most people's standards, weaker ones. You still have to figure out what you can do in the case of this sort of opponent who you have to deal with from fairly far. Because that is one of the main things you will deal with in any strong Abigail's matchup. They hit literally like a truck, but when he chooses not to do that and hit lighter buttons, he hits from very far away. And I'll use some matches that we had earlier today with a Platinum Abigail player possibly to show that off. Was it Platinum or Diamond? I think they were in Diamond. I don't know why the Diamond player was at joining. They were probably doing Abigail work. In this case, I'm not willing to assume that my reputation precedes me. Important things, as well as your command normals, lets you know how far away you can stand from certain characters and still be safe while you're doing things. Because many of our heavy normals, while not completely safe, have ranges where they are safe. Ryu's I'm starting with because his are functionally safe and decent range, but they're not very good range. So they're actually safe based on their property. So my aim here is to move Ryu into positions where Abigail wants to press things, and if he does, there'll be mediums and quick, but they won't actually manage to counter anything because there's no chance of them countering anything that I'm hitting that's too light, and if I am on the right timing, they'll hit like that. This is actually part of the reason why we see that property of people, as they say, fishing for crush counters in neutral. It is because other people's ability to do so is hampered by needing to use things, buttons in this case, that are not as strong as the heavy buttons being pressed. Now, while this is generally considered a bad practice to have, because of the way that the game rewards you for doing these things, this may be changed in the upcoming version, depending on how the move itself works out. Certain things we've already seen in the latest footage from Arcade Edition at PlayStation Experience at Capcom Cup, that we are seeing some reduced reward, but not a change in the system. Therefore, this is probably functionally still useful. Crush counters are not being removed from the game, nor are they changing heavily in terms of their universal properties, but they are definitely changing in terms of your ability to get certain amounts of damage from the more effective in neutral ones. Note again, this is not for every character and I don't have confirmation of this, but this matchup is one of those matchups where you need it a lot, and you can see that very quickly here. But simply mashing the crush counter button, as I'm apparently doing, is not really going to solve your problem, because your opponent will just figure out what to press in order to cause you stress themselves. Still, it is easy to get rewarded for doing certain things when Abigail tries to do giant flip, for example, because it's a long startup, and while you would think, oh well, Ryu's going to get hit out of that, it doesn't actually work out that way. The move takes long enough to start that you could just hit this button on reaction, and I'd go so far as to call it easy to do. Part of the reason further that Abigail is used for this is because Abigail's jump animation is actually really useful for doing this. He is the character who has difficulty getting to you without doing something of that nature. And he has a slow enough startup on a lot of his moves, you can even learn to react to seeing them happen. He's very good for conceptually doing this. There are other characters who can also fulfill this role for the kata, but we don't have enough clarity on all of them to say this is definite, and therefore we suggest Abigail for it, especially if you have some fight money left over. He's a good character to have both the bot for and a good understanding of how to play against. So even if you aren't really that interested in the character, but you like don't have anything to spend the fight money on, you've got enough for whoever you need from season 3 and all that, Abigail is definitely a good character to spend some time learning your things against. But rather than go into that in full detail, we'll go back to the third part of Kata as a general thing. The final thing to deal with is that Abigail has a command throw when he's coming in close to you, and he has some decently good wake up pressure. Illustrated there. His jump is good in that way. His sweep can bring him in from far. There are a lot of ways for the opponent to get a lot of meaty pressure on you in ways that most characters in this don't actually do when you put them to the CPU setup. They either do it in a predictable way, or they're not so strong in neutral that you have to worry about it in the first place. So that's why we're using Abigail for this. When Abigail knocks you down with the CPU, and if you happen not to quick rise, you'll notice that a lot of the time he will walk up and go for command throw on your wake up, and again, because it's the CPU, it tends to be able to do this perfectly. But even more usefully, he does this as one of his primary things from the knockdown of Giant Flip. So when you fail to do that correctly, when you fail to throw him out of the kata part that you're supposed to do, he tends to back off and do one specific thing, or come up and do a different specific thing. But he never seems to completely change out of his rhythm because he got to knock you down. He's also a very tall character. And because he's so tall, it's easy to see when you've hit or have not hit when you do what we will call your jumping wake up. It's not quite an instant overhead because overheads mean that your opponent was actually blocking crouching, and it's fuzzy guard related. So we're going to call this one instant jump wake up just for the sake of this stream. If you have a different term for it, by all means use that term. And we will probably not use a specific term on the kata page. But the idea being that there's a lot of stuff that Abigail does that you can stop by doing that. And there's a lot of stuff that Abigail does that you must stop by doing that. But this leads us to a problem. That move doesn't normally hurt Abigail very much. In fact, normally it puts you in a situation where Abigail has at least some capacity to hurt you. Because you end up going right over his head like that, and then he can grab you. The key to that is understanding that not every character can hit you on the way back down from that sort of move and actually do a lot of damage. Furthermore, you're looking for when he can't do it because he doesn't have any meter to do it with. So we have the knockdown, and he has that specific jump that helps him quite a lot in that situation. So you eventually learn the spacing at which you can do this sort of jump. You also learn, for certain characters, exactly what buttons you can press to do this jump with. Obviously, for Ryu, he basically only has his lights. On Chun-Li, with Abigail's height, you can get her medium kick. And she has other options as well. Bison is a little weird, and so on. But this is air-to-air awareness. We've got Alex Bot, who is supposed to teach you how to deal with air resets when you're the one doing them. This kata is meant to teach you how to deal with air resets on your character when you're the one on the receiving end. Because Abigail will, based on many different factors, hit you out of the air with different timings when he does this. Or he will not hit you out of the air at all and will go for a throw as soon as he can. Finally, of course, there is the part where you're doing your wake up anti-air, which is not absolutely required, but he does have a few spacings where he will jump. As far as we can tell, the CPU tends to jump twice whenever it intends to do this, and therefore you get a very strong telegraphed version of whether or not to do this move. So to put all the pieces together, your general aim is whenever he does do Giant Flip, which he does a lot, if he's at the right range to be thrown, you should throw him. If he's a farther out, depending on your character's crash counter buttons, you should hit one of those buttons. Or any heavy that would probably do the job in this situation. When he's close up on you like that, and you expect there's a chance that he will go for the throw, you jump out in that way, and then you look for what needs to happen directly after that so that you don't take a lot of damage based on anything else he does. Those being the main 4 parts of what you're aiming to do. So, we're going back to step 1. He does Giant Flip. And you throw. And as demonstrated, even cancelled Giant Flips can be thrown in exactly this way. It's just that the timing is a little different. You have plenty of time to do this. The move takes about 30 frames to come out, I think. When he does this, you're aiming to wake up with your instant. It's usually a light button. And you're watching where he moves to and what he does before that point, in order to understand what button you should be doing. This is very important for protecting yourself from his ES Giant Flip, which I assure you can also be thrown, but again, a different timing altogether. Because that move is also plus and continues for quite a while. Abigail is an interesting character in that staying close to him can often be better for you than getting very far away if you are prepared for dealing with him. Because otherwise he'll do stuff like that, where you are not in range to actually throw him, and then you have to recognize the fact that you're not in range to throw him and hit your fastest heavy button. In all this, you must also learn to do whatever anti-air is most useful. And you get to see a lot of how your own normals interact with his run, EX run, and so on. You will also get to see the fact that a lot of his jumping attacks don't even need to be responded to. But the important thing is spacing yourself relative to Abigail such that you can confidently strike some button that he would expect will actually deal with him. And there's a very specific range for that for every character, for every button that the character uses. And since they are crush counters, they convert into massive damage most of the time. The other good reason for this being that even if they trade, Giant Flip actually does not do that much damage. It is more useful to Abigail as something used to get in on you that is safe for him. Another notable point is that if you are Ryu style character where your heavy button, you have at least one heavy button that is really safe, like -1 or something. Many of Abigail's better buttons after being pushed out that far, or in the range where you would want to hit that button in the first place, are relatively slow and easily defeated by simply pressing the button again. If you've had reason to press it from closer, then often you can defeat Abigail's buttons with your medium buttons instead. Other things Abigail does are covered in the Abigail bot, which is available as usual on 2-mk.org/bots. Whereas most of the things you would need to know about these specific moves weren't necessarily worth bot work because, one, they were plus in the case of that actual flip, and two, you can't really deal with command throws in that way. It's more of a way that you deal with the game in general. But this part is a part that cannot be shown via a bot because the bot will simply either move forward or not at any given time, unlike the CPU that, while it is not like a full Abigail player, which I can demonstrate, it's close enough that you can get away with a lot of things that you wouldn't think you would be able to, and through trying you can learn what those things are. In fact, I chose Ryu specifically for unfamiliarity, which is why you don't see the standard Amara color. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to a character that I am a bit more familiar with for this, and show off what they can do. Even though I haven't played them before, I am familiar with the ranges of their buttons, so I've not done the Kata with Bison before, but I'm relatively confident in my understanding of the ranges of Bison's attacks and the speed that they're able to be done at. So yes, I am in no way afraid of hitting stand heavy kick in neutral against Abigail. In fact, I think Abigail should generally be the one that's scared when Bison decides to just stand up and hit stand heavy kick in neutral. The good part about this for Abigail is that Bison as a character doesn't have a lot of options if he's going to do just that. So it's not a whole game plan. It's not Abigail is going to lose if you do this. But it's definitely enough that Bison can use it when in certain situations without being too afraid of it. But again, this depends on your understanding of the range of Abigail's movement and Bison's flow. Because this move is relatively shorter range, you have to be very precisely aware of where you can hit it from. And Abigail has the option to simply never let you get to that spot. But that is of course because that move is +3. And therefore, Abigail doesn't have a lot of options if you do press it, because you're still plus, you could just hit it again. In fact, I don't think his counter even works because of some various interactions. That I was aware of, but now let's move to the move I'm not aware of. Bison is fortunate in that he has Psycho Axe to do this with. But Psycho Axe is relatively punishable. So there must be some specific perfect range at which just hitting that is a good idea. Whereas with Ryu, his stand heavy kick and stand heavy punch cover the giant flip situation very well. Bison is not so fortunate. He has things he can press, but as you can see, just having heavy buttons is not in any way a guarantee that you're going to get away with this sort of thing. But let's go back to this part. Note how relatively easy this is, and note how much Bison functionally gets off doing it. Again, a good real player will not let you do that to them. But having the option to do it when they get frustrated, or even after a few times where they've managed to land a giant flip because that's the way you normally play now, and then reversing it on them because they were not either aware it could be done, or not really thinking about it when you started to do it. But again, we're noting the issue that Bison has relative to Abigail's spacing with that. Psycho Axe does not in any way deal with giant flip. In fact, it's just looking to get yourself in trouble. But this could be to your advantage in a matchup where your opponent thinks you are going to go for a Psycho Axe and therefore does giant flip. And you just don't. You just grab them, do whatever. But we can use his back heavy punch, even though it doesn't crush counter, and see what that does. Now this is a move I will fully admit I have much less experience with because I'm not that style of Bison player. But I do know the range of it fairly well. The problem with this move is both that it is relatively slow and that it doesn't do a lot from this into anything that you'd actually want to do, especially not in neutral. It's also like -5, so you can't do what you were doing with Ryu. Abigail can in fact just punish you for hitting him with it and it being blocked, leaving you in the situation where you end up thinking, well, what should I actually do here? Because if I'm just hitting this button, which I know is not the greatest of ideas, what am I aiming for? This is a situation where the character you're playing makes the medium button work. This is not always true, because most characters will end up trading with Abigail's normals, and the trades are almost always in Abigail's favor, even if purely because he has more health than anyone else. But understanding the capacity for your medium normal helps you a lot. And if you've done our other katas, you have a very good idea of why particular characters really shine in that regard, and Bison is one of those characters, having literally a 22 frame stand medium kick. It is not only extremely fast, it is relatively high in hitbox, allowing you to push back a lot of things but still stop a lot of aerial approaches. If you push Abigail back far enough, then you get other options such as that. But once he's gotten to a space where he's probably going to win out for you, you have to understand that it's okay to just hit the stand heavy kick. especially if you don't have time to get out of his way and you don't want to risk something like being hit with his crouch medium kick after some combo. Well, not combo, but a certain type of block string, for example. If you understand the range well enough, you can just hit the stand heavy kick as your defense system entirely because he cannot actually hit anything after blocking it. Abigail's moves are so relatively slow that, and extend their own hurt bots so far so fast, that it's basically free pressure. Bison does not have to worry about anything Abigail does from there. In fact, you can just do this pretty much all day. And wait for the Abigail player to attempt something else that you are able to deal with because you are so plus that you're technically, it's as if you were neutral but better. But of course, you must learn the range at which you can mash it. Can you mash it twice here? Will it work if I hit it a second time? And if it does work, then what do I do after that? 1, 2, 1, 2, and I expect giant flip, but I don't get it. That sort of thing. There is still always an interaction that you need to deal with in the game as a result of doing this. But because Abigail's normals are slow and he can't get away from a lot of things, you get to play very rough with him. This is why he has that parry. And it's quite useful in many matchups. But because it is so incredibly quick and relatively, I wouldn't say it's shorter than most parries, but it's definitely something you could read and decide, since his longer moves are further away, you could just block. Because the key to what you were doing was trying to make it so that once Abigail is playing neutral with you, he doesn't get to bully you with his long buttons and go into things to make your life miserable. The aim is to defend against that sort of thing by understanding that for many characters, Abigail just being our current guinea pig, when they are trying to keep you out so that they could then do another longer move to stay safe or just to be spaced perfectly, a lot of the time they are not spaced perfectly versus more risky things. Namely, like expecting them to do a certain thing and grabbing them out of it when they're coming at you. Characters like this, for example, are Juri, whose Ryodan Satsu is throwable, and hopefully soon will not be. Bison, who can be grabbed out of the startup frames of probably Psycho Crusher now that he has it, but he can definitely be grabbed out of the Psycho Burst startup frames. Hopefully he would never be doing them at that range, but certainly command grab characters can do it. I'm not absolutely sure of the priority on certain other things. But since that counts as a projectile, you have a lot of options. Lara absolutely can get through it, for example, and Mika can do other heavy kick style moves, so on. Because once Abigail is closer, he can start his pressure from much further out than most characters, and you don't get to counter pressure him unless you know that you can do this. He can become an overwhelming force simply because he is too far away from you for you to start hitting your own medium buttons safely. He'll trade with them and usually win, or do some trickery and get in on you. But you can do that, and knowing that you can do that is a massive change to this matchup. Knowing that you can do that is a further massive change to this matchup. The key is to understand what other characters this is a change for. So we're back into the final part now of when Abigail knocks me out of that or blocks it, what am I supposed to do when I land? Well, let's put Bison in V-trigger for a little bit. You have to be careful with him specifically because while his best button for doing this with is actually his light kick, it also can trigger if you decided to hold down back for some reason, which you generally should not do when you intend an instant wake up. If you have the intention to do an instant wake up jump on a charged character, try to get yourself into the habit of not actually holding the down back when you do it. Commit to that from the beginning. The issue being that the CPU will usually respond, but since Abigail particular can't do that much about it, you can also learn the timing for doing it properly. Where you just happen to be holding down back because you normally do, at the last moment your opponent has moved in close, so you've decided to do a certain thing, let's say with Chun-Li or Guile, who actually have invincible wake-ups to do stuff with, and you've decided, okay, I don't think that I want to actually use the invincible wake-up, I just want to jump. And I'm going to hit a light button when I jump. Be careful with this because you may end up activating a move you didn't intend to. But after a while, this is something you will also get used to in terms of execution, and it shouldn't be too bad for after that. The final part of the kata, as mentioned, is the understanding part. There's a specific reason why Bison is able to throw Abigail. Generally, you should basically trust that the level 8 CPU will cheat. It will not allow itself to be hit by a throw that it could have stopped. It does occasionally do it, but often enough that you can just do stuff like that. So a lot of this depends on where Abigail is in the air, if he happened to jump, or what move he was actually trying to do when you jumped out. I suggest for this, to make it a little easier, you don't quick rise because it makes you more aware of the timing for various things, especially if you got taken by surprise. Some of his moves will effectively not let you quick rise. But it can be hard to time the quick rise for certain of Abigail's moves when you're not used to him. And this is also true for other characters who have similar things, where the issue is not that you cannot quick rise. The issue is that you should not, and that their meaty depends on it. Namely, like Lara, to some extent Mika, Chun-Li to an extent, depending on what you did. So we're learning on Abigail, who has time to reposition himself when you do not quick rise. But it's not less applicable because of that. A lot of the time, if you want to get out of a throw, you can do a move that you think will leave you in a particular situation. For example, you have a throw invincible move, but it's like a Shoryuken, and if it's blocked, you have at least a chance of being relatively heavily punished. The thing you need to check is, against this particular opponent, against this particular style of play, am I going to get punished that hard for going for just the instant jump light kick? Which is usually the button you want to hit for most characters. If I'm wrong and my opponent goes for, say, a low in order to trick me, does my instant jump light kick get me out of the way of the low? Does it stop any of their other options? Do they have really good options for defeating me once I've done it, after I've gone over their head, or even before that? All of those things are important things to understand, but you won't be able to get any of that information without understanding very well yourself when you are at advantage or not at advantage after doing such a thing. As noted, you can also use it for anti-airs, especially if you know which button anti-airs him well. This is less likely to be great against most people, but for many characters their jumping light kick is good for that. You can also learn what happens to your character when they attempt a certain move. There is the concept of axis shift, which means that you will be in a certain state when you are counter hit out of your jumping light kick. Depending on the specific of your opponent's meaty, how close they were for it to being perfect and so on, which button they were hitting, and a lot of other little factors come into whether or not you can actually be seriously hurt. You definitely get hit, but does that hit lead to you being in a lot of pain? Because for many characters, getting hit in the air like that, their opponent doesn't necessarily have a good air reset in the first place, so there's nothing to be particularly afraid of. Your choice is either taking the command throw or getting hit by what is basically a very small attack. This is not true for most grapplers, and therefore you shouldn't really think of it as an anti-grappler strategy. But hybrid characters, of which Abigail is technically one, Abigail, Nikali, Vega as well, these are characters that have command grabs, and soon to be M. Bison apparently, but don't base their game plan around the throw game to the point where they are likely to have very strong meaties that give them command grab option, or in some cases that you just don't even fear the command grab that much. So that is the other thing you're looking for here. For Bison in this case, I am attempting to, for example, do the instant jump out, but immediately try to hit down back again, or just down, because if I need to jump over his head, I won't necessarily know where down back begins or ends. So that I at least have a charge of something for when I want to deal with this. Now, since this move is so easy to stop, the obvious question would be, well, why not just hit a jab or something? And if your character's jab air reset is very good, then that might actually be your better option. But there are many characters who don't have good enough consistent anti-airs to do this, or their anti-air is a move, or it's just something that you really would not want to miss time if he happened to do one of the versions that you're not used to. Maybe that move requires execution that does not allow you to hold down back while doing it, and therefore requires an extra mental effort to do, opening you up to other things that you don't want to deal with. We noted the usefulness of throw because throw is the thing that gives you the most leverage in terms of deciding whether or not you actually want to try to do it. Learning a perfectly strong method of doing something may limit you in your growth if you are not able to consistently do it in a real match. When it depends on execution that is beyond hit these two buttons, or depending on how you have your controller set up, one button. This is literally a one-button solution to a relatively large, or in fact, let's go with extremely large, given it's Abigail. It's a one-button solution to an extremely large problem. Until you are used to the matchup enough to say, okay, I think I can handle spacing against him so that he never has a good reason to use this move, it's better to be able to do that. And it's better to be able to do that while doing a bunch of other stuff. Note, of course, that you cannot throw him out of his avalanche press. And once again, if you really want to learn to deal with avalanche press, there's a whole bot for that. But for now, the Kata concept is simply this. Grab, put him on his back. If you really like your forward throw better, the interesting thing to note is that if you are confident enough, it's not too difficult to go to straight down to do this, which will allow you to treat it as a regular forward throw. If you are confident enough, that you are going to be able to throw him and you don't need to block. It also, I will note, doesn't necessarily matter, because if you hit throw and try and he's about to hit you, it really doesn't matter that you were going to block either way. So yeah, you can hold down back and it's a very short switch to go to down to hit the throw. You can practice this as well if you find that your back throw is not good for your purposes against Abigail for some reason. This is Abigail's specific tech, of course. Against most characters who put you into this situation, you probably want to hold down back while you're doing it and just deal with whatever back throw issue you have later. If you're really confident, of course, you can just do this from standing and not care at all. For certain characters with particularly strong parry setups, you can do stuff like that. Which, again, the CPU is not going to let you do too much of. But you can still get a couple off. But note, when I do it this way, which has nothing to do with actually getting out of the throw mix-up, but can still teach you some things, we end up having the air reset situation. I clip him on the way out, and as soon as I've landed, I have to decide what am I going to do when I land. And Abigail has time to decide what am I going to do when this opponent lands. I could end up too far away, or in Bison's case, I can just hit stand light kick. And doing that will often force your opponent to not wait until you've properly landed. To act immediately, in some way. That might not be the safest action, especially since, unless your opponent is very familiar, they don't want you to let you get away from there. They don't want to just see you jump out and clip them on the way out and then just give up all the damage they could have possibly gotten. So a lot of lower level opponents, or people who are just frustrated easily, will go for something bigger because they figure, well, you're sailing over my head, I have all the time in the world now. But they don't. It's actually relatively difficult to do properly, because they can't afford most of the time to hit you with an air reset attack, and the execution for certain other things is difficult. If they do the certain thing much faster, then while the execution is not necessarily difficult anymore, the damage payoff is much smaller. And Bison has other trickery that he can do, of course. So get thrown, Abigail comes up, beats you up. Comes up, beats you up. This is particularly useful when you know that your opponent doesn't have a way to hit you out of your super when they're done, or they're close enough to chip. This is another thing that you can learn that is relatively difficult to do, but if you can time it right and execute it, which I can't promise because this can be super hard, you're aiming to do this sort of thing, which allows you to use your meter to make crazy comebacks even after being set up into throw loops. Of course, for those of us who expect to be able to do that sort of thing to giant flip, there's another reason why in the Abigail matchup specifically, and in certain situations with Cammy, for example, that you end up using the throw when you can, because the parry is not necessarily unreliable, but you have to learn a lot more about how to get the parry done than about that. And once you've learned the timing for one, it becomes easier to deal with that when you need to. Bison generally doesn't want to parry this move because he gets hit anyway. Abigail takes no damage. If you have a lot of life and are fairly desperate to have that to throw at him when you need it, by all means, go ahead. Just figure out the timing for that and do that as well. This also trains your meter awareness, as blatantly demonstrated by the fact that he can in fact do something about it. And almost all characters can in fact do something about it with either their V-trigger or their super. But the chances are that if you were in that bad a situation, that you really felt this was a good idea, you already probably dealt with their super. So your air-to-air situations are easily worked out from here. And while Abigail is not really a character where you get the full extent of the experience as to what he can and cannot do, there is still definitely enough to let you understand when you're doing it well and when you're not, and so on. For example, learning how to do it so that you hit your opponent in a timing that doesn't leave them with much correct timing is very important as well. Because your opponent is generally in a situation where they get hit by a move and they have to wait for the block stun of the hit stun of your move to be over before they can do their own. But many people are going to mash on reaction to the fact that they got hit. And while it does not seem this way, it means that you actually have control over when their move comes out. Particularly for tall characters, this is something that you can deal with Zangief relatively well, in fact. Even though he can do Borscht Dynamite and become a problem, it usually can't be done that quickly or easily, especially if he was expecting to do something else at the time. And as you can see from there, Abigail's lows actually don't hit Bison at all when I do this. This could be, again, a matter of a poor meaty setup on the CPU's part, but we are still dealing with that as a potential thing in many matchups, where the meaty is not quite perfect, but let's say the throw part is that you have to worry about the throw, but if they went for something else to beat another one of your options, it wouldn't be that great. So while the CPU will generally correct for the spacing and timing that you hit it in, it can only hit so much. And we go back to what we had before. If the CPU attempts to hit a button because it is just a thing that it can do, and your throw happens to come out such that the frame that your throw will connect on is the same frame that their attack will connect on, then you win. All these things are interacting to change basic things like waking up from meaty stuff to a much more complex game setup. So let's review this with character who doesn't have the same level of normals in terms of capacity for doing this particular thing. While Chun-Li has decently good attacks for this, they either don't lead into much or have even more specific spacing and range. This is similar for Karine, to some extent Lara. Our Mika is usually better off because Lady Mika is plus, so it's very similar to doing things with M. Bison, but overall, you do have some extra options. The problem with certain characters like Chun-Li is that the trade-off for the distance that their normals hit from is the fact that they're whiff punishable, and Abigail is not bad at the whiff punishing thing. This is because his hitboxes go so far forward from his main body that it's easier to catch your own hurt boxes as they retract from your own move. But that changes the situation around entirely. You're still doing the same thing, but for a different reason. In this case, we're doing it because it is more possible with characters who have long buttons like this to whiff punish Abigail's buttons. Like that. Abigail has a much harder time playing in the long range neutral with characters who can wait for him to hit a button, or when they expect him to, and then hit him with theirs while he's recovering, because he has the same problem. He has fairly fast stuff that can reach relatively far, but it doesn't necessarily retract as far as fast. The difficulty being, of course, getting out of the range where this matters. Again, for her, I really should just be hitting, like, medium kick. As you can see, while this works quite well, I can't specifically say how safe Chun-Li is when it happens, because now I have to learn, where is she when this happens? Where do I end up after doing this? This also gives you some information about the particular way that your character's jump works, which is very important for many other things as well. You can also have the situation where the hitbox of your move goes into the wrong space or takes too long, so that, for example, trying to actually counter Giant Flip with Chun-Li's stand heavy kick is much harder than with Ryu's. Fortunately, it does mean that she is much better at dealing with it when he does it from a much further range, but he doesn't have a good reason to do it from there. And therefore you're less likely to be very aware of that as one of his main options, because he doesn't have a good reason to do it, so it's harder to deal with. You end up doing it so early that he tends to get knocked out of it, etc. If he was close enough to the point where it could be done late or as a trade or similar, like that, the situation is probably going to be a little different for Chun-Li than it is for Ryu, and probably not as advantageous. So, what can I do with that? Well, obviously I can just use Hake instead, which seems decently safe given what the move is. Her back heavy punch. But, as you would be aware if you've ever tried to anti-air with it, the vertical part of the hitbox for that move is nowhere near as good as Ryu's heavy punch, so Abigail tends to get away. That is part of what's important to know. If your button does not have a relatively high up, the top of its hurt box is not that good, then you have to be in this sort of situation where I've pushed him to the corner and I relatively know where he's going to end up. Therefore, then I can hit it. However, can I hit this button in neutral? Because everyone else was relying on a certain amount of space. Well, I can definitely get away with it based on the fact that the move is so plus that there's really not a lot to worry about. But if I don't know the spacing at which I can hit it twice, then all of that's for naught. In this case, for example, I should probably hit Hake and then her back heavy kick. And as you can see, despite what it looks like, that actually works out relatively well for me. But not well enough. There's still a spacing that I need to understand in order to make this effective. I can't just go, okay, hit this button and then hit this button and then we're good. Understanding that range is extremely important for both this matchup and general other flows. And she's again one of those characters where you're probably better off in a lot of situations going for one of your medium options simply because it's easier to deal with what happens as a result of you pressing it. Another good reason for this is understanding your character's throw range. Although Abigail does not always make this matter to you, it can matter quite a lot because the distance he does the flip from affects how likely you are to be able to actually grab him out of it. At certain points you really should just block because he's too far away for it to make any sense to try. And Chun-Li, who has a relatively short throw range, ends up in this situation a lot. Whereas if you were used to playing a different character and you thought, well, I can just do this, you might quickly learn that this new character that you're playing with the much shorter throw range is not in fact able to do it at the ranges you would expect them to. Fortunately for us, Abigail doesn't tend to do too many ranges where he can't be grabbed. He gets closer and closer as the move goes on, so you might have to wait longer, but he can be grabbed by just about anyone. It will, however, teach you what happens when you hit too early. Because it will not even count as a counter hit in that case, you will just get hit instead entirely. So you can watch the counter hit indicator to figure out whether or not you pressed too early. And if you were pretty sure that this works out fine on your other character, just out of massive amounts of experience with doing so, then you would be able to say, oh, well, this character that I'm working with now appears to have a short enough throw range that I just can't actually grab him. Again, this is rare, but it's still useful information to have because it is a way to get used to a new character's throw range with a very strong visual to tell you what is going on. Especially if you do this on grid and you like position yourself in the corner or something. You can watch Abigail's feet very closely and decide how that works, but he does have a tendency to throw you out of said corner, so be careful about that. So here we are, whiffing in neutral, getting whiff punished because you shouldn't just whiff random moves at Abigail in neutral with Chun-Li. Recognizing that obviously far out space where if he does that, nothing good will happen. But you're looking for where he could stand to make that work and become confusing. And if he stands at that range, then what button should you press? So I'm watching his foot relative to that now. And as soon as his leg gets behind that line, I switch from thinking I should use throw to I should use hake here. But until his leg gets behind that line, I'm going to default to throwing most of the time. Get away. He's also one of the characters who is easiest to understand pushback on. So you can just use this for extra information there as well. So as noted, even if his foot is a little bit over that line, if I start trying to throw this, I'm almost assured to fail. Back you go. He's also thankfully a character with very few cross-ups and a bunch of linear stuff, so again, if you really want to do this in grid, you can use that technique of just cornering yourself, using your heavy normals so that you don't have to do any repositioning to think about whether or not your stuff is working. You just have to time it right and figure out from there. So you see, he was still mostly behind the line. If his toe got over it or something, I'm probably not in a good enough situation. And at that spacing, I don't feel like doing anything at all. The furthest one I meant. So both grid and Shadlu base will give you this sort of thing. There are a few other stages that have a good marker on the ground that you could mentally get used to over time. It's not necessarily easy to work from there in order to get things translated to other scenarios, but you can definitely like measure it and understand the character specifically and see what you get out of that. For example, I can show that I'm pretty sure that the hake works if I'm really expecting it, regardless of how close he is. But there may still be a range at which he's too far for this to be a good idea. In fact, I'm pretty sure there are such ranges. Getting him to go to one of those ranges is just a matter of hitting him hard enough in some direction. Eventually it'll work out for you. You can also use this for the same reason as mentioned before, because he tends to push you forward by walking forward when he's doing his other stuff, so you get to see where you end up when you get hit, you get to see where you end up overall. All sorts of things can be measured very accurately by simply cornering yourself against Abigail and then checking that. So I'll note, for example, that I end up standing on that line. And that gives me a good idea of how far away I can really expect to be from Abigail when I land, at least in that specific spacing, if he's right up next to me after the throw. Or after this knockdown. So to end off the stream, I'm going to go back to the main menu. And take a look at 3 matches that were had just today with a Diamond player who was playing Abigail at the time. I don't actually remember what level their Abigail was. We'll only look at the Chun-Li ones for now, since the Just Fine's Rainbow Mika ones were definitely not focused on the same thing at the time. So this is a level 47 Abigail, apparently. A Super Diamond level 47 Abigail. Is it Super? I think it was Super. Or just under that. No. Anyway. They stopped by our battle lounge for some reason. So thanks to that dude Fizzy for this.
Round 1. Fight.
So you'll note that my aim here is basically the same thing. I understand Abigail's ranges to a point, and I'm aiming to stay at that range where not necessarily Abigail can't hit me. But what he does to hit me changes his game plan. Which is why we see all the trades with the Kikogans. Honestly, I should have jumped out of that the same way, but I think that this player was more likely to actually cause me problems if I did. Another good reason for this is because if they've mistimed one of their guard crush meaties, Abigail can't change direction until the end, so it's kind of an issue. That was a terrible fail of meter watching, but it does get the round back to where it should be, us thinking about that particular interaction. There's a good clip. And the aim is once again to stay at the range where you have enough time to decide things when it comes to Abigail. Not necessarily that your decisions are easy, because Abigail is not a character who gives you easy decisions in the first place. He is definitely built around forcing people to make too many decisions and then doing a lot of damage off of one bad one. Similar to Balrog stuff. Just more defense and a little bit more fair in terms of corner carry. Obviously, some level 47 Abigail Diamond play there. But it does illustrate that you can in fact change that matchup to the point where it slows down. Your opponent might then attempt to do more things regarding his run, EX run, and so on. But as you get to higher levels, those are the things that start to fade out of Abigail play when he's either not doing a knockdown or when he's in particular setups. And knowing when to let him do that, when to push the opponent to do that, simply because you can in fact react based on the space you're at, is important. Because the other thing you can end up doing to yourself is letting him get to a space where he will attempt to do it and then just avalanche press you as you try to jump over. You have to be able to wait long enough to decide, should I block? Should I get out of this? Should I jump back? Should I hit an instant button? What am I aiming to do from the time I have here? I love that combo. That's one of the best Abigail combos. Note the range that he's at now. This is the perfect range for Abigail, and this is the perfect situation for Abigail. He has put you in a terrible situation in the corner and now has control of exactly his own position, and you get to do pretty much nothing. If you've already reached that point in the match, something has gone wrong already, because he's not actually that good at getting you there. You'll note that despite that, he did not actually push me back that far, and a lot of his stuff tends to crumple. But here we are. Once I'm out of it, then, he's forced back into more or less the same situation of looking for hits. And the hits he gets don't have a heavy corner carry on them. I wish that move dodge ties. So while there's no doubt that this player is holding back at least on certain parts of their capacity, a lot of that could simply be that they aren't either expecting a lot from the opponent due to rank, or that they just don't play that way. There's always an opponent out there who just doesn't do the thing that will beat your tactic. Whether or not they are quite good at everything else about the matchup, they could simply not have focused on that aspect of it. And this is mostly just with the understanding of what the kata is supposed to teach, given that, as I said, I really haven't done that kata with Chun-Li as a general practice thing. I think I might have done it once. But at this point of this match, the theory alone was what I was going with. So I didn't actually know all the ranges perfectly. This allows you to experiment with ranges on moves you really wouldn't expect to use either. Such as that. Fong has similar spacing situations actually, if you understand what you're doing with him. It's just that Fong doesn't have to get close to you to deal with you in the first place. There's supposed to be a way to deal with that, which I have not learned yet. I strongly suggest you learn it, but it's not in a bot or in the kata because it's relatively simplistic conceptually and just takes a lot of practice to actually do. But note now that the spacing I have is slightly off and I have to go back to the correct one and start using crouch instead to get under a bunch of things like that. Because if you let the spacing go off, then the Abigail player has a lot of control. Still, I will go over this one more time before finally fully ending the stream to bring something else to attention. That one got me too close, for example. He does have punishes for the crouch, but not the best. And I was in V-trigger, so. Sadly, I went for the jump. Oh well. But now we're going to take one more look at this to illustrate the point of both why this is meaningful against Abigail and meaningful against other characters that can be kept at a certain range with either your buttons or understanding when to throw them out of moves. The key to this is to watch the damage. That's the only thing you really need to focus on at this part. Abigail can make your life completely miserable, but he can't do it and kill you very quickly. He's generally doing one or the other. This is not to say he is in any way handicapped in doing massive damage. But as you can see from that, the situation in which he gets this massive damage is not most of the match. There's a specific spot in the match where he's able to do that explosive damage and kill you off. Or when you've made a mistake because your neutral is weird and he clipped you with one of his heavy normals for some reason. And then your life melts away. But there's a reason why, despite being probably one of the strongest characters in the game, even if he is going easy, it's not as if this Diamond Abigail can just throw out massive amounts of damage. He is confirming, he is doing relatively optimal combos short of actually using super in certain situations. He just doesn't hit that hard. When the time comes, of course, he will have built up all those resources and gotten all that advantage in trades and have all that health to do it with. And once that's happened, your life will be the one melting. But aside from that, he's a relatively ordinary damage character. And a lot of the advantage that comes from having those quicker buttons of his at that range is that he's likelier to use them. Fortunately, he doesn't tend to need a lot of meter for much, so there's that too. So once you've learned to get out of command grab mix-ups when you can really surely read them, and learn to stay out of the harassment phase that lets him build up a ton of meter before you do, you can gain some advantage in this way. So, if you're interested in this kata, you can find it at 2-mk.org on Sunday or Monday morning, depending on whether or not we're all caught up watching Capcom Cup. So you can assume that this will not necessarily be released right at that timing, but it will be up by at least Monday night. If this stream was insufficient to give you the information you needed as to how to go about doing it yourself, once again, this does not involve a bot. There are no inputs to change or put in. It does involve a DLC character who you would have to purchase in order to use this particular kata, but it's a character that's probably worth having at the moment just to train with. So, with that said, we hope that you enjoy Capcom Cup this weekend, and that you pick up any good news, if there is any, about your own character or characters in Arcade Edition. There's definitely a lot of information floating around on Twitter at this point. So go check it out. Maybe you'll have something to be very, very happy about relative to this game. This is Rillian broadcasting from Amara 2_MK to 2_MK. Good night, everyone.